Talking cars, zany animals, and lots of rosy-cheeked tots feature in children's literature. But as diverse as that sounds in one way, it's not all that diverse compared to the kids who are reading the books. With us on how that could change, Zetta Elliott, author of numerous books for children and teens. Her most recent work, the novel Dragons in a Bag, was named a 2018 Notable Children's Book by the Association for Library Service to Children. And Léonicka Valcius, assistant agent at the Transatlantic Agency and a planning team member for Brampton's Festival of Literary Diversity. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
It's been a fun opening since you've been here, so it's nice to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for giving us a chance to have this conversation.
Well, before I start, I want to read a quick passage from your latest book called Dragons in a Bag. And this is your character, Trump, speaking to his grandson, Jax, the main character in the book, as they're in the process of returning a pair of dragons to the realm of magic. You write, "This realm is a sanctuary for many beings and creatures that just wouldn't be safe in our world. But the longer they stay hidden here, the more foreign and frightening they become to humans. People fear what they don't know. And when you're separated from folks just because you're different, well, our people know what that feels like." Powerful sentence. When did you know that you wanted to be an author, Zetta?
Oh my goodness. Well, I always tell people that I knew I was a storyteller before I knew what it meant to be a writer. And so from the time I was very young, even preschool, my report cards say that I was getting in trouble telling stories to the other children while the teacher was speaking. So I think I understood there was a relationship between storytelling and troublemaking. And then I became a very sort of a good student, and I was doing everything right at school, and at home things were a little bit different. And I had an English teacher, Nancy Vickert, in the 9th grade and the 11th grade, and she was the one who sort of pulled me aside and said, "If you want to be a writer, you will be." And I thought, you don't just decide, like somebody has to give you permission. And she was like, "No, you just decide, and then you write every day."
And do you think without that teacher's support or guidance, or even just perspective in seeing what you could do you think that you would have been able to pursue a career in writing?
I didn't know that you could have a career in writing. I think when you're a child, books just magically appear, right? You go to the bookstore, or for me, you go to the library, the school library, the public library, and books are just there. You have no idea that a book is the result of a number of deliberate choices made by industry professionals and not just a writer, because you can just write every day at home and that can be satisfying, but to become an author, to enter a professional arena, there's so much more preparation and so many more hurdles and doors that are closed. I had no idea. I think if I had known how hard it was when I was a teenager, I probably wouldn't have bothered. So I'm glad that I was rather ignorant and just got to enjoy writing and storytelling for my own sake when I was a teen.
That's really interesting. Léonicka, you also work in the world of books.
I do.
What Zetta just said, if she had known what she knows now, she might not have done it. Would you do the same? How do you feel about it?
I can hear that statement and see how it affects so many writers. A lot of the work I do and a lot of the reasons why I became a literary agent is because I love writers and I love the worlds they create, and I wanted to be part of that process to support their creativity and their art and help them make a career out of this. But it is difficult and it's confusing. We are in a business that is based on a subjective art form, but seems and tries to create very rigid standards of what is and is not acceptable. And we never interrogate acceptable to whom and best-selling to who and for what, and who's our audience, who are we trying to reach, and who do we define as storytellers?
Zetta, earlier this year, you wrote an article for the Toronto Star where you said, you wrote, "It's not easy being a Black child in the great white North. I grew up on the outskirts of Toronto. In the 1970s and 80s, I had no Black teachers and no one working at the library looked like me. Black children were largely absent from the books I read as well. I adored fantasy fiction, but fairies, unicorns, and magic carpets belonged to white children in England, not awkward Black girls in Canada." In that same article, you write that when you were in your teens, you wrote your first kids book.
I did.
But the story was centered around a young white girl.
Right.
How come?
Wow. Well, I also read historical fiction, so I would say the only mirror books, to use Rudine Sims Bishop's metaphor of books being mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. When I was very little, I had Ezra Jack Keats's books. White Jewish man from Brooklyn who was making The Snowy Day and all those beautiful books. And then there was nothing until I got to be around 9 or 10 years old, and then I read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor, which is historical fiction. And that book planted a seed in me that was really important, and I think it's not a surprise that I went on to write a dissertation around racial violence because I was introduced to that in that book. But when I was reading fantasy fiction, it was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I loved stories like The Secret Garden and E. Nesbit's The Phoenix and the Carpet. And so if I saw myself in books about historical reality, when I was in the realm of the magical world where anything could happen, adventures, you could open a door and enter another world. That never happened to a kid like me, right? There was never a little black girl with an afro in Narnia. All kinds of other creatures, but not someone who looked like me. So I either had to dream myself into existence or I had to identify with the white characters. So when it came time for me to write my own story, and that was for a creative writing class I took in high school, which I failed. I had an F. I dropped it before it could show up on my transcript. We had to write a story for kids, and I wanted to write something magical. And so if it was going to be magical, it had to be a white protagonist.
How do you feel now, knowing what you know about that?
It's heartbreaking because almost every month I have a black or brown child, come up to me and say, Ms. Zetta, look at my book, I made it, and it's full of blonde hair, blue-eyed people. And sometimes they'll even say, that's my family. That's not your family, right? But it's so easy for kids still to become white identified because those kids are having the adventures that they want to have. So that kind of self-erasure, when I talk about decolonizing my imagination, I really wish I could stop other black and brown kids from having to go through that. But I think it's going to continue because we just haven't seen the kind of transformation we need in publishing.
And Léonicka, you had a job where you placed kids' books in schools.
Yes.
What would happen during Black History Month?
Oh, Black History Month was always a difficult time for me because we had such a limited selection of books for Black kids, for all kids really, that were reflective of the Black experience, but also the range and variety of the Black experience, especially here in Canada when we're so influenced by the US. So many of the books for Black History Month were US focused. So I would be asking beyond Viola Desmond, for example, who else do we have? What other books do we celebrate during Black History Month for kids? Who are the Black Canadians that we push towards the forefront? And who are the Black Canadian writers? So occasionally I would go on Twitter and say, okay, make a list of your top 10 favorite Black Canadian writers. And I said, okay, next year we're gonna make a different list. And I'm gonna ask you the same question. Can you come up with 10 others? And most people couldn't, and that would break my heart.
I mean, sitting here, I don't think I can. Zetta, you've talked about research done by the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Right.
Could you walk us through the graphic that they produced a few years ago? It's actually going to be on the screen right now.
Right. What it demonstrates is that the overwhelming majority of books feature white protagonists. And we know that the little boy who looks in the mirror and he sees himself as the king and the firefighter and the astronaut, and he's got a big grin on his face because think about what that does for your self-esteem when you see yourself over and over and over again. Every heroic role is open to you. And then the Indigenous child and the other children of color, they only have one mirror. They're looking at it and they're miserable because they only see their unhappy selves. And when we do get books for Black and brown kids, they're often problem narratives, right? Issues around overcoming oppression, and a lot of historical fiction and realistic fiction deals with that. So the CCBC has been compiling annual statistics for decades, and I really wish we were doing that in Canada because it allows us to take a look at what the industry is producing and to gauge our progress. Are we making progress? What we saw was a marked spike in the last 3 or 4 years in the number of books about kids of color. So the problem is we always talk about diversity, and there's a great group that's doing work. We need diverse books. But when the publishing industry hears that, what they say is, oh, you want variety. You want a wider range of stories about a wider range of people. We can do that. And they simply go to their existing stock of writers so that last year, half of the books that were about Black children were not by Black authors.
Why is that problematic? If the goal is to have more diverse stories, why does it matter who tells those stories?
Because it's about equity. right? If we talk about diversity divorced from equity, then we aren't talking about equal access to opportunity to tell your story your way. And so Black writers represent somewhere between 3 and 5% of all of the kidlit creators in the United States, and we're about 13% of the population there. So why is it that other people are being given permission to tell our story in their way when we have our own stories? And it's not as though the stories don't exist, right? So you have an industry that is dominated by one group, straight, white, cisgender women who don't have disabilities, and they're drawing on pretty much the same group to tell stories. So all of the opportunities, all of the wealth, all of the power, when we talk about issues of sovereignty, who gets to tell your story? I'm not for censoring any artist. I think everyone should be able to write about what they want. But I think if a white author decides, I'm going to tell the story about this Black character, they need to at the same time acknowledge I have privilege that is unearned, that is giving me the opportunity to tell this story when there are Black authors who want to tell a similar story in their own way and they're not being given the same opportunity.
I want to come back to this in a few minutes, but Léonicka, you're working to get more diverse children's books published. What are some of the obstacles that you face in the work that you do?
Well, part of what I do specifically is to tackle this question of equity that Zetta brings up. I specifically aim to work with writers of color. That's part of my personal mandate. It's an important part of the work I do because I understand that you cannot separate stories from the storytellers. And that perspective, that lived experience, and that point of view is so important. So some of the obstacles I face really is having writers understand that they don't have to be in the pigeonhole that the industry has set up for them. My personal tastes, I love fantasy, I love historical fiction, I love romance, I love beach reads, and I love adventurous, funny children's books. And so it's hard for me to explain that to publishers who expect me to be representing one type of story, and to writers who've always been told that they can only write about one thing. They're like, well, you know, I went to a conference and I said that I didn't want to read about slave narratives, not because they're not important, but because that's not where my tastes are right now. And so many of the writers were Black writers and who said, I'm not, like, am I allowed to write about other things? Not in so many words, but concerned that their voice is not valued in other spaces. And so I spend a lot of time breaking down those barriers and trying to overcome that self-erasure, right? Like, it'd be fantastic to have a great teen thriller with a Black girl protagonist. Why not? I won't be the one representing it, but somebody should do that.
Right.
So yes, I try to share that information as much as possible and share everything that I've learned along the way.
Zetta, I want to go back to that graphic we saw in a few minutes ago, and we saw, you know, animals, trucks, etc., outnumbered, all of the ethnic groups combined.
Right.
Do you see an issue with using non-human characters to tackle diversity stories?
Absolutely. So we have new graphics, and we have another graphic that'll be coming shortly. And it is problematic because we went from about 12.5% in 2015, and it has doubled. And so what we see is publishers pivoting, and they aren't necessarily drastically increasing the number of books about kids of color and Indigenous children. They're reducing the number of books they are producing about white children somewhat, and then making those children essentially into anthropomorphized animals.
Why is that?
I think greeting card companies also did the same thing. There's a feeling that animals are neutral, that they're apolitical,
Universal.
right? They're universally appealing. And that's not true because we know that they're given human characteristics and traits, and they're gendered and classed and raced in all different kinds of ways. I have a colleague, Edith Campbell, who's doing really important work on the use of monkeys in books for children, because monkeys, especially the ways that they're depicted, are racialized often and given attributes of African American children. We can go back to Curious George, who's a tool of colonial oppression, as much as I loved Curious George. So we really have to be careful about the ways in which animals are used as a substitute. And then it doesn't reckon with the structural problems within the publishing industry itself. And that's really where we need to get the conversation happening. Usually it's people of color, marginalized people, talking about we need greater diversity and equity in publishing, but we really have to get to the gatekeepers, right? We have gatekeepers who are making decisions. And so The kids I work with, urban teens, are desperate for horror. They see one of my covers and it's got a black woman with a bloody hand, and they're like, I want that book, right? They're desperate for those narratives, and we're getting them in Hollywood. Jordan Peele just made Us, right? And that had a huge box office appeal. We know that Black Panther had a huge box office appeal. It doesn't translate. It just doesn't make sense that publishers would walk away from potential income, because we often hear the argument, well, we would love to have more diversity, but we have to have books that sell.
You were just mentioning the gatekeepers, and I think when we usually hear gatekeepers, we think of older white men. In publishing, who are the gatekeepers?
Straight, white, cisgender women who do not have disabilities. And it's the predominance of women in the industry has created a kind of culture, or what I like to call the cult of niceness, where I once heard a woman refer to the publishing industry as bunny eat bunny. And there's this feeling that you have that bunnies are innocent and kind and sweet, and therefore there isn't the vicious kind of competitive spirit that you might see on Wall Street or some other corporate environment. And that's absolutely not true. When you give someone absolute power, it corrupts absolutely. And so you have a very small group of people who make decisions. And it's not just editors, right? Because a book that gets acquired by an editor then has to be marketed. I had so many conversations at the Festival of Literary Diversity with mostly women of color who had difficulty getting their books marketed and promoted correctly. Dragons in a Bag wasn't reviewed in Canada. I mean, in Canada, I think my research showed that on average 2 or 3 Black authors have a book for kids or teens published a year. So never mind 3 to 5% in the United States, we're less than 1% of kidlit creators in Canada. So when you have so few people who are getting published and then their books don't get adequately promoted and then they don't get reviewed, libraries, the overwhelming number of librarians are straight, white, cisgender women who don't have disabilities. Most libraries have a policy. If a book is not reviewed, they will not acquire it for their collection.
I didn't know that.
So it's a system, right? Like, I'm so glad Léonicka is an agent and she is there to provide sort of the transparency we really need as writers to understand how to navigate the industry. But it isn't just 1 or 2 bad apples. It's not, no one individual can change the system. It has to be structural.
Somebody that is a favorite in my family is Robert Munsch. And, you know, his titles include Bear for Breakfast, Wait and See, and Where is Gan Ning? How do these books fit into the larger narrative of the kidlit landscape in Canada?
Robert Munsch is absolutely a Canadian icon, and it would be, we would be remiss to not talk about how much he's done for the idea of Canadian children's literature. And I think those books are important. But I also think when we talk about diversity in children's books, it's not only about the representation within the pages, but the representation of the writers. I know Zetta does so many school visits, and those school visits have such an impact on those children, right? When they see, oh, that's who wrote that book? Oh, maybe I can write too. That creates more storytellers, that opens up their opportunities. And the question of who should be telling stories is more important now because we have so few of those stories. If we had thousands and thousands and thousands of books representing all varieties of races and ethnicities and gender expressions and abilities, we would not be so concerned when one person writes outside of their quote-unquote experience, because that book would not become representative of an entire group of people. But as it stands, Robert Munsch's books were often maybe the only time kids saw representations of those groups. And is that really enough? Are those books enough to say that's my whole idea of a group of people? I don't think it is.
It's not a complete picture. And I think the problem that we often see, there's been a lot of activism online, and there's a rather strident and assertive group of people on Twitter. Many are young adult or kids' books authors, and they are looking for the inaccuracies, because you can get a book all the way through the publishing process because there's such a lack of diversity within publishing professionals that a book that is problematic can end up on the shelf and in the hands of young readers, and that can do a lot of damage. So one of the things around having own voices representation, and that's a term coined by Corinne Doivas, who does disability and kidlit. She's an advocate it really matters that you have an insider perspective because you're more likely to get an authentic and culturally specific and relevant representation. And it's not to say that someone else can't do research, because they can, but we have so many instances of books that are problematic and then they get pulled, or they are critiqued online, and people think that that's unfair, but where else can we have that conversation? I feel like that's a kind of guerrilla warfare, that when people of color and Indigenous people are marginalized and kept out of the publishing profession, sometimes social media is the only space in which you can have a conversation around which books are appropriate, which are accurate, which should be read but should be talked about and moderated, a conversation moderated in a particular way.
You actually met political activist and author Angela Davis.
I did.
And she said something that stuck with you.
Yeah.
What did she say?
She said that her parents had prepared her to live in a world that didn't yet exist, which is so profound, yeah. And of course, Angela Davis went on to do so many incredible things with her life and is still leading the way, leading movements, especially around prison abolition. But I think sometimes we get so mired in the current situation, and it is rather disheartening. I have to say, I get fairly despondent. I've been a diversity advocate for a decade, and I did decide a couple of years ago that I was going to write fewer essays. I still give a lot of talks on the subject.
And you self-published it?
And I self-publish. And a lot of times people think that self-publishing is an act of vanity. Oh, you just want to see your name in print. And because they don't understand the racial dynamics and the disparities within the publishing industry, they don't understand that when I say to them, actually, for me, self-publishing is an act of resistance, right? When someone says to you over and over and over again, your story doesn't matter. Your voice doesn't matter. What they're saying is your community doesn't matter. There's no market for stories like yours, which is completely untrue. And then I have to go back to the classroom where I'm facing 30 to 35 young Black and brown kids who are desperate to see themselves in the pages of a book. I know that I have to take matters into my own hand. And we have a long tradition of Black people publishing their own work, especially a Black feminist tradition, Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith, women of color, Kitchen Table Press. So I just really feel like we have to think about the overall dynamics of the publishing industry. And I think that's partly my job, is to give greater transparency. And when Angela Davis says her parents prepared her for a world that didn't yet exist, I'm writing books, especially fantasy books, so that kids understand they have the power to shape their reality. So when I walk into a classroom, I say, I embody possibility, because I can say, who knows how you get published? And a lot of kids don't. And I explain the process of an editor reading your story. They give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I show them my first picture book covered in gold stickers. And I say, when I sent out my other stories, did I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down? And God bless them, all the kids have a thumbs up. And then I have to go, thumbs down, right? And that's sort of an introduction to a conversation around meritocracy. It is not a meritocracy, but you can move from, I got the thumbs down, and then I went and made my own books. And you can make your own books too.
And you've done that.
I have.
Just one more quote from your article in the Toronto Star. You write, "Tales of Magic teach us about power, and all of our children deserve to see themselves saving the world." Before we leave, could you both give us a couple of recommendations for books, maybe from your own, that kids should get their hands on? Zetta, I'll start with you.
Well, the sequel to Dragons in a Bag is coming out, so
In
I'll
October?
give a plug for The Dragon Thief. Yeah, and a book that I read recently and an author I met recently was Hurricane Child by Corinne Callender, set in the Caribbean, which is fantastic. With a lot of Caribbean kids in the US and in Canada. I would recommend that, and if kids are into zombies, I liked Dread Nation a lot by Justina Ireland.
And Léonicka?
One book that comes to mind is Love from A to Z by S.K. Ali. I wonder if her publisher calls it Z, but we're in Canada, so I'm going to say Z. It's a YA romance with two Muslim protagonists. I'm very excited to read that. I read her previous book, Saints and Misfits, and loved that a lot.
Well, thank you both for being here. You've shown us that you can really make your dreams happen. You just have to work hard and, keep pushing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.